Well, so now, God willing, I want to turn to the computer and say about the computer, there's nothing magical about the computer. I did all this work without computers. I mean, a rapidograph and a hand calculator, but it was maddening because there are thousands and thousands of arithmetical operations demanded by the execution of this algorithm. And if you screw up in any of these arithmetic moves, you'll blow the final configuration of the wave. So the computer guarantees accuracy. It keeps us always perfectly positioned in time, and it gives us to 5 decimal points accurate depiction of this mathematical object. So really what the computer is like a camera eye that is allowing us to rove and scan at will through a fractal curve revealed by the mushroom and claimed by it to be a map of the ebb and flow of novelty in hyperspace. Now that would be challenging enough, I think. However, that's only half of what you have to swallow. Remember how I said each stage follows more quickly than the one which preceded it? Well, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out then that in a system like that, eventually the stages will follow each other one upon the other very quickly. And throughout this weekend, I have hinted by implication that history represents a kind of ingression of a new epoch of laws and possibilities into the biological world. Still more so, the 20th century represents a further quickening of this process of the ingression of novelty. But since the collapse factor is 64, we're actually on a collision course with a singularity of some sort. And the wave description of history that I'm going to show you will only correctly predict history if it is placed against the historical data in a certain unique configuration. The problem with that is, if it's a problem, is that that configuration seems to predict that the most novel moment in the history of the evolution of the cosmos lies only 18 years in the future now. And I had chosen this date based on the mathematical constraints of the theory before I learned that this date, December 21st, 2012, is the date for the close of the Mayan calendar. Now, this is an extraordinary coincidence. The only thing that I have in common with the high classic Maya is that we both used mushrooms. Is it conceivable that if you go deep enough into the mushroom, there's a kind of barcode message at the end of the hallway? And when you decipher the glyph, it says, discard before December 21st, 2012. So now, well, there are two things to talk about. First, I want to look at the wave with you and try to convince you that it is, if not true, at least it's like, if it's not true, then I've trapped a hallucination in a mathematical cage, because if it's not true, then it's a kind of virtual mirage of truth, because it seems true. It's simply that it leads to an impossible conclusion that the world is going to transform itself unrecognizable in a few incredibly intense moments 18 years in the future. But then once this possibility is enunciated and you begin to look around you, this seeming improbable proposition begins to make a certain kind of sense. And that's where then you have to decide ideologically where you're headed with this stuff. Okay, well, enough razzle-dazzle. Now, Tamara, did you want to frame it?
Yeah, how does that relate to, like, the Tibetan calendar or the Indians and Indian calendar? They sort of had an ending time to the world.
Well, the Indian calendar is cyclical but eternal. That's where you have very large cycles of time, larger and larger. This calendar is cyclical, but it's what's called a damped oscillation. You know how if you pluck the string of a cello or something, it will make a tone, but it will finally run down. That's a damped oscillation. This is a picture of a damped oscillation. We could almost think of God plucking the string of universal nothingness, and out of it emanates the tone of apparent reality, which then condenses into a series of damped oscillations which push novelty toward one, and concentrate novelty toward one end of the process, and then it moves off into a higher dimension. I mean, there's the cosmology in a nutshell. Yeah.
How did you reach the same conclusion the Mayan calendar?
Well, I reached the conclusion by fitting historical data to the wave and then simply going and looking to see where the 0 point of the wave fell.
What is the historical data?
Well, all the historical data. I guess I should explain that.
Where did you start? Where's the beginning of that curve?
Well, the cycles can be propagated backward into time to scales larger than the known age of the universe. Here's the way the game is played. First of all, let's be honest here. History is not a quantified data field. In other words, we can't say the French Revolution was a 22, the American Revolution was a 16, or something like that. History is not a quantified data field. Nevertheless, if we're going to talk about something called novelty in history, I think broad general statements will find general agreement. For example, the Italian Renaissance was very important for world history. I think anybody who wants to fight that is on a loser's binge. Here's another statement. The Greek Golden Age was very important for world history. I mean, you may not like it, you may think it's a white boy's game, some beef like that, but let's face it, you know, Greek science became Western science, which rules the world. We're not making moral value judgments here. We're just trying to look at history and say, where were the great breakthroughs which configured subsequent events? So I named two areas, the Greek, the Periclean age of Athens, and the Italian Renaissance. Well, so if you had a theory of history that predicted novelty, and it failed to predict either of those epochs as being novel, it would be reasonable to think your theory was bogus, right? Okay, so that's how the game is played. We're going to look at some history, and we're going to put the wave against it. And we're going to talk about whether or not the wave, in fact, predicts the ebb and flow of novelty as we collectively, as a group, know it to have occurred. So it's like a little tour of the past 6 billion years with the roadmap of the novelty wave in hand. And we'll be looking at the landscape going by, and we'll be looking at the roadmap, and we'll be asking the question, is this map a map of this road? That's a simple enough problem. Okay, let me see if we can get into it, and this will maybe be more clear. Okay, now we're gonna look at this. If anybody wants to come up and sit on the floor, it's fine. Unfortunately, it's a problem to see this screen for so many people, and the technology for projecting computer screens is kind of Mickey, so just to please yourself. Okay, now, with what was said before the break as the prolegomena, here's the deal. Prolegomena? A prolegomena comes before, an epilegomena comes after. A hapax legomena occurs only once. Do you know what a hapax legomena is?
No.
It's a word that occurs only once in the known literature of a language. Isn't that a strange concept?
Like that word.
Maybe. Okay, now let me see if I've got this puppy set up. Yeah, I'm going to hold him up.
About time.
Graph the wave. This is always the, yes, it worked, good. Okay, now, everything I said, if you didn't understand it at all, what's going to happen now should still be somewhat coherent to you. This is a graph of novelty over time. It happens to be 6 billion years because I chose it to be 6 billion years. Today, it is down here somewhere. The lower the line, the closer the line to this horizontal axis, the higher the novelty. This is the reverse of a stock market graph. In other words, we don't want to see it go up, we want to see it go down. And what it shows is that over the last 6 billion years, generally speaking, novelty has been increasing. However, there have been some major hiccups in that process. So it's not a smooth descent into novelty. Yes?
Right. Novelty.
Yeah, these two terms, habit and novelty. When the wave is ascending, habit is increasing. When the wave is descending, novelty is increasing. Novelty means new connections, new technologies, new languages, migrations of people, cometary extinctions, surprises, the unexpected, innocence, number 25, the unexpected. Habit, on the other hand, means traditional activity, repetition of previously performed action, inertia. I think the gestalt difference between these two things is fairly clear, am I right? Habit and novelty, that says it. Okay, so now here's what I'm going to do to try and convince you of the power of this idea. We're going to look at the history of the Earth, from the earliest Earth down to the earthquake in LA 2 weeks ago, and I will lead you through the data, and the question you should be asking yourself is something like this. This clown says that this describes the ebb and flow of novelty in history. Does it fit my personal intuitions about that subject, right? Okay, 6 billion years on the screen. Now what it's showing is that at about 4,900,000,000 years ago, there was a very steep descent into novelty. This is the condensation and stabilization of the crust of the planet itself. I mean, this is literally the coming into being of the Earth here. The condensation of the Earth, the formation of oceans. I mean, there was some kind of catastrophic period before that, but here a stable planet forms. And then this period of exploration down to about 2.8 billion years ago. This ends with the earliest forms of prokaryotic life. And then, I don't know how many of you, prokaryotic life is life where the DNA is naked. It's not contained in a cellular membrane. That comes later. Those are called eukaryotes, and that's one of the great early transitions in terrestrial biology. But at the appearance of the prokaryotes, oxygen began to be produced as a waste product of this early form of biology, and oxygen was a toxic reducing gas. It actually threatened the evolution of early life on the planet until membranes and enzyme transfer systems could be evolved that could essentially allow life to survive in what was a toxic, oxygen-rich environment. And that's what this shows here. This is the crisis created by the accumulation of atmospheric oxygen. Once it was evolutionarily overcome, the plunge into novelty resumes with a vengeance. Now, someone could say that this is all so imprecise. I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of years here. Yes, but we're going to close distance with the present with ever finer and more precise resolution. Always remember that the position of the wave has been chosen so that the maximum point of novelty, the maximum singularity, rests on the solstice moment of December 21st, 2012. That's way down here. That's the only point in the entire mathematical system that has a value of 0. It's the unique 0 point. That's why the program is called Timewave 0. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to exercise just one of many of the program's functions, and I'm going to zoom toward the present, and we're going to see half as much time on each screen and twice as much detail. Do you understand what's happening? We're flying into the data by a magnification factor of 2, and then I'll explain and interpret it as we go along. Okay, here we go. If you like, yes, it's optional. Zoom, yes. Seek minimum, no. Approach factor, 2. Billion years. 1.5 billion years. Get the idea? How it works? Now, this is, for all practical purposes, other than little globular slimes and stuff like this is the real history of biology on this planet. I mean, if you were to go 1.5 billion years into the past, it's dreary indeed. I mean, there is no life on the land. There's life in the sea, eukaryotic, microscopic life. But this is essentially the entire picture of the thing. I'm writing a book about this, and I called the book History's Fractal Mountain. And there it is. This is the signature of time itself. And notice that on the highest level, what this is saying is almost trivial. What it's saying is that everything has a beginning, it builds to a middle, it falls to an end, there's a period of reflection, and it's over. And now this could be the firing of a nerve, or it could be the life of a star. It could be the history of a species, a love affair, a company takeover, an atomic explosion. In other words, it's a process. All process is embedded in other forms of process, process within process within process, until you reach the highest level of the all-inclusive process called the cosmos. So what this is saying is that between 1.3 billion and 700 million years ago, roughly 800 million years ago, there was a period of increasing habit, increasing reversion to traditional patterns. Now, what this actually is life's conquest of the ocean and the filling of the ocean with multiple species of life and the development and occupation of all niches in the ocean. Then, 800 million years ago, life leaves the sea. That's the symmetry break. You can see it right there. And from that point on, the conquest of the land by plant and animal life has, at this scale, been virtually a smooth cascade into novelty, although you can see that there is stochastic oscillation in the last 200 million years of that process. Now that, yes?
If you think of, just as a side thing, if you think of novelty as the hexagram of innocence, then you might think of the other condition as number 12, stagnation.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, that would be an analog.
That's good. Okay, so this is basically the picture of the career of biology on this planet. And notice that it has a period of fluctuation around a mean, but then about 60 million years ago, it falls to an entirely new level of novelty, and then the mathematical details are lost in the compression of the data field, but we can explode them. It's so much fun to say stuff like that. Seek minimum, no. Approach factor 2, yes.
Here's a quick question on
750 million years.
does the
375 million, yes. What?
information on the right, does it describe what's happening historically, or do you have to do we have to know all of that biological history?
This is a menu. Well, what I'm trying to do is find a CD-ROM company who will give me a pile of money so that I can build a huge image-based chronological database so that by just pointing at a place on the wave, we would be flooded with fossils, armor, battle maps, text, you know, like that. I haven't yet crossed that Rubicon.
The Berkeley Mac Club have got their own CD-ROM out and have all the equipment to do that.
Yeah, well, I've been through the mill. It's as weird as Hollywood, the world of multimedia. I mean, if I had $1 for every million that's been tossed around in conversation, I could buy a VCR. Okay, now, this is the last 375 million years. The last 375 million years. Now, some of you who are students of is his name Stuart Dawkins and that crowd, know that the reigning theory now in evolutionary theory is called the theory of punctated evolution, that evolution occurs in sudden spurts, then stabilizes itself, and then does it again. Here it is, folks. This is what we're seeing here. These are sudden surges in speciation, which I don't have time to go into it here, but in my book I'll go into it in excruciating detail. These correspond well with known periods of evolutionary surge following extinction events. We don't know whether these extinction events are planetesimal impacts or geomagnetic reversals, but they're very large terrestrial changes, either mediated out of Earth dynamics or from the extraterrestrial environment. So here you see it over 375 million years. Okay, now I'll resume the zoom. If anybody has special knowledge in some field and wants to health, that's fine, yeah.
Is this information derived from biological things or paleontology or what's the...
Paleontological data is what we're looking at this scale, yeah.
Before you leave that one, can you show us, I don't see quite a 64 times
No.
faster cycle yet. I mean,
Well, see how it always runs down here? This is one way of mathematically portraying that spiral involution. The data could be plotted along a logarithmic spiral, but instead it's deployed here along a standard Cartesian axis. These are just different conventions about how the data should be displayed. There are ways to portray it that would show it as an involuted spiral. Okay, now let's resume.
It being a spiral and having 3 dimensions, does that, here we're only looking at 2 of the dimensions, so when that spiral moves along this, when it moves along the spiral, is there something happening there that...
Well, this is an interesting question. Obviously, the Earth cannot be treated as a point where novelty is concerned. Otherwise, when I laughed, you'd laugh. You know, there would be no such thing as misery in the presence of joy. There would be a homogeneous medium. I have not figured out how to deploy the wave over 3-dimensional space. With a silicon graphics machine, you could write programs to fiddle with this possibility, and then you would be able to not only predict when the novelty should show up, but where it should show up. And that would be add a very powerful dimension of description to the thing. Okay. All right. Zoom, yes. No.
How much is in
2. Huh?
how far from the right, from our right is... Oh, okay.
There's 93 million years. Now remember, we began looking at 6 billion years. We're now looking at a much smaller amount of time. Also notice that as we get closer to the present, our data is both denser and more accurate. I mean, when we say when eukaryotic life appeared, hell, you could be off 200 million years and it would hardly matter. But it's getting more precise. Now, on screen, we actually have very precise data about an event which occurred 65 million years ago and that was very, very temporally confined. I think I mentioned it earlier, that on a certain day, 65 million years ago, a planetesimal object struck this planet in the vicinity of Yucatan. A subfragment impacted near the Solomon Islands. The fragment that struck near the Yucatan was 25 miles deep into the planetary surface in the first 3 seconds of the impact event. It raised a wall of rock 40,000 feet high that moved out at Mach 4 from the impact center. I mean, you cannot conceive of what this is like. And all life on this planet, larger than a chicken, died. All life on this planet. The dinosaurs died in a single impact event. The evidence for this is overwhelming. The people who don't believe this have a tough and slippery row to hoe. The evidence is all over. I can state it for you if you want, but take it from me. This is as secure as any other fact in the canon of natural science. It happened, folks. And any theory of novelty would have to predict it, or it would fail. Here we are, 65 million years ago. There it is. There's the impact point. Now, at this level of accuracy in terms of the wave and the known date of the impact, this is a bullseye for this theory. It predicted the most dramatic event in the last 100 million years. It predicted with 100% accuracy. within the margins of error of the known data. Yes.
And that's an event that happens very, very fast. In other words, before that, there was no change necessarily in the level of habit or novelty. Then suddenly we have this major event that happens, and you go straight down.
Well, you would think, why isn't the point here? Well, you're right. You're absolutely right. Well, but what has given a small measure of hope to the anti-planetesimal people is the fact that it is true that a die-off was in progress for unknown reasons. In other words, in the several million years before the cometary impact, it is true that there is a decline in the number of species for unknown reasons. We may get back to this in the course of the morning, because I suspect that biology has a transtemporal dimension and that it was actually bracing, in a sense, bracing for the impact. But that's speculative. Yeah.
Was there a real convergence between this event and the graphic there, or did you use the event as a marker to place your module when you started?
No, I didn't use this event to place the module. The two events I used were the Italian Renaissance and the late 20th century.
So you were way down.
Yeah, I was way down in the details of the data. This is one of these successes of the theory, that it correctly indicated where this planetesimal impact occurred.
Was there a novelty fluctuation when you discovered the Timewave? Did you look back at that?
Well, it's in a period of steep descent into novelty. We'll probably pass through it here.
You're backcounting in from the end of the Mayan calendar. Wouldn't that just have one peak every 64th of a cycle? In which case, what are all the little peaks for? In other words, wouldn't you just say there's a peak of novelty at each of those, the apex of the curve? But how can you add all the little ones?
Well,
where do they come from?
Well, I guess I didn't. The part of it that I spared you was, remember when I said I got loaded and I figured out how to mathematically collapse the wave, the occult diagram into the Cartesian wave? It's built into this. I just spared you the mathematical details of how this was done. It's trivial but maddening. So it's all explained in my published stuff. It's all been gone over by professionals. It's solid. It's just too much to expect a non-mathematical audience to put up with. Okay? Okay. So 93 million years on the screen. Now we're going to zoom again. $46 million years, 23 million years, 11 million years. This is our story. This is our story, yes.
You covered most of the mathematics and basis of the theory of this in the invisible landscape.
Yes. And the invisible landscape will be republished on the 15th of April in a new edition from Harper. So if you enjoyed True Hallucinations but wondered what the real basis for all that was, the invisible landscape is an absolutely uncompromising and pitiless revelation of all of this stuff. Okay, the last 11 million years. Now, this is the period in which the primates go from being one of many complex mammalian orders to emerging as something of quite a different order. Bipedalism, binocular vision, the descent from the trees, the coordination of language, so forth and so on. And, they're moving these skeletons around all the time. Homo habilis, the whole pantheon of skeletal material that backs up the theory of human origins. What this basically shows is that for the last 11 million years, there has been a fairly smooth descent into novelty that reached a kind of equilibrium about 5 million years ago, and that's when you get the earliest hominoids, and then went along oscillating more or less around a mean, and these low points, which we'll look at in more detail, are glaciations, until about 100,000 years ago, and then there was an even deeper plunge into novelty. And remember, this is all being generated from December 21, 2012, and we're now looking at only 11 million years, a tiny fraction of the time we began with on the screen. So let me zoom again. And I should say, I'm using this zoom function, but the software has many functions. We could choose out any portion of this and explode the data endlessly, and there are all kinds of functions that are not being discussed here because there simply isn't enough time. Zoom, yes. Sorry, zoom, yes. Seek minimum, no. Approach factor, 2. 11 million years, 5 million years. Let's look at this for a minute. Now, notice that the theory is not shy about making predictions. It is very clear and concise. I mean, these predictions, if you wanted to, are to the minute as to where the novelty maxima fell. I mean, if we went into one of these troughs and blew it up and blew it up and blew it up, we could get right down to the minute. It is an incredibly mathematically precise and unambiguous thing. Now, all it predicts is where the novelty will occur. It doesn't say what the novelty will be. By being so conservative in what it says happens, it gains great explanatory power in saying when it will happen. It's almost like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, where you can either state the position or the velocity of a particle, but you cannot state the position and the velocity. As one comes into focus, the other loses resolution. These are glaciations, and when you compare it to the established data on glaciations that petrologists and paleontologists have assembled, the agreement is striking. You know, there is excellent agreement with the data on every level. This is the last 5 million years, and this is the extraordinary environment in which human beings were hammered out on the anvil of evolution. And it's clear what was going on, that one thing that was driving evolution was because of these glaciations, gene populations were repeatedly being islanded, indemnified, and then the glaciers would melt and these indemnified gene pools would flow together and create unique genetic combinations. Then the glaciers would come again, re-indemnify the gene pool, then melt again. And as you see, this happened over and over again. Well, this is a strategy for pumping novelty out of a biome, out of a biological system. Okay, now, so the evolution of the proto-hominids is going along across here. These are a combination of glaciations, geomagnetic reversals, and climatary fluctuations. And when you put all this data together, it is in pretty striking agreement with this, which is generated, remember always, simply out of the I Ching. I mean, this is a pure mathematical abstraction. Okay, now let's go forward. On the screen, 2.9 million years on the screen, 1.4 million years on the screen. Now, some of you may have noticed, just as an aside, that occasionally a screen will go by that you may have the impression you've seen it before. This is because every 8 levels with an approach factor of 2, the topology will repeat, but the numerical valuation is always unique. Every point in the wave has a unique numerical valuation, but the topological relationship repeats in a series of fractal resonances. Well, by factors by multiplicands of 64. See, I mean, by multiples of 64. Okay, so this is the same picture that we had on the screen when we had 6 billion years on the screen, remember? So now the fact that we have this pattern again is an opportunity for me to talk about another level of this theory, which is resonance. Because patterns repeat themselves, this is a theory of time as a kind of interference pattern, as a series of resonances. So remember I said this is where the Earth condenses? Well, this is also where the cometary impact fell that extinguished the dinosaurs. Remember that one? It's also the descent into human organization 1 million years ago. I mean, by this time, the genus Homo is beginning to make its influence felt in Africa. I mean, this is really the descent into humanness along this gradient here. The oldest Homo sapiens skeleton known to exist that is anatomically indistinguishable from modern human beings is from the Classis River Cave mouth site 100,000 years ago. People that looked exactly like you and me, as far as we can tell from the skeletal remains. Let's go forward and look at that. Factor of 2, always just to keep it consistent here. Okay, 1.4 million years, 700 million years, 700,000 years, 360,000 years, 183,000 years on the screen. Here is the rapid evolutionary descent that stabilizes Homo sapiens sapien as he and she exist today right there. This is the beginning of authentic humanness. And you see then that once the human type was established, then there is a fluctuation around a mean, obviously, epidemics, migrations, minor local extinctions, minor climatary fluctuations, so forth and so on. But from here on, look how close to the singularity of the 0 point the thing is operating. And I should say, you need to link what I'm saying here with what I said yesterday about how time is not pushed from behind by causal necessity. Time is drawn toward the future by the presence of a singularity, the attractor.
Where was that found?
The attractor I'm locating at the winter solstice of 2012 AD, which is right down here. So what we're saying is that novelty, there is a kind of ultimate novelty dwell in the universe, which the process of universal evolution is orbiting around in a decaying orbit that moves it faster and faster, and eventually it will actually fall into the event horizon of the singularity, and that this is now only 18 years in the future. That's the hard swallow. Every theory, let me say this about the hard swallow. Every theory has a hard swallow. If it seems absurd to you that the Earth could transform itself in a single few hours, 18 years in the future, remember what orthodoxy teaches. The orthodox faith is that the universe sprang from nothing in a single moment for no reason. So if you sneer at this singularity, just be aware that your drawers are open, because science is balanced on an initial axiomatic absurdity that defies scaling. You know, I mean, you can't imagine anything less likely than that the universe would spring from nothing in a single moment. Yes?
This is a map of time, but all the points that you show are related to mankind, not the universe. It's strictly on planet Earth. How do we know what else is going on? You're forming us as the center of the universe, and everything that happens as happening here.
Yes, exactly. Because I think a fair examination of nature will lead to the conclusion that nature tends to concentrate novelty at a cutting edge. For a long time, the cutting edge was physics. Then chemistry replaced physics as the cutting edge. Then biology replaced physics as the cutting edge. Then culture replaced biology, and global electronic culture replaced culture. The interesting thing about this theory is, one of the interesting things is, unlike science, which says you are an irrelevant spectator who by sheer happenstance happens to be in this universe, this theory says you are the child of the cosmos. You are important. Humanity matters. The human drama is an extension of the drama of life, which is the drama of matter. It once again makes human beings metaphysically central to the process of being. It re-empowers us as central players in the emergence of novelty on a cosmic scale. That's right. Yeah.
Are you implying by that then that nowhere else in the physical universe that there are people like us or organisms higher in the culture? Why not physical?
Well, it doesn't really make a statement about that. What it is a wave mechanical description of the evolution of novelty on the Earth, and it makes no statement about the extraterrestrial environment. However, as we'll see, we don't get many opportunities to predict extraterrestrial events, but as we will see, the cometary impact on Jupiter next July, it does pick up. That's maybe an indication that it is a solar system-wide wave system rather than a planetary-wide wave system, but I see no reason to extend it further than the...
If you recall that, then the applicability is really Earth itself.
Well, I follow your thinking, but I'm not sure I agree with it. When I try to think about how could someone have figured this out, let's accept for a moment that maybe this is true, then how in the hell could somebody have figured this out? Here's what I imagine as the basis of it. I imagine a prehistorical civilization somewhere in Central Asia that is psychologically and in its cultural values very different from us, and that is involved in something which, for want of a better word, let's call meditation. And let's leave out the issue of whether it's psychedelically driven or not. Let's just call it meditation. It is true that a very deep set of meditation techniques called the clearing of the heart techniques can be traced back to that generally same geographical area. So here's what I imagine. Experimental, spiritual people meditating. And, you know, there's a whole thing in the I Ching about meditation. It's the hexagram keeping still, which says, you know, and that's what these stilling the heart techniques are about, is keeping still. And I think what's hinted at here is a kind of yoga where by keeping still, by suppressing heartbeat, breath, suppressing all the gross functions of the body, the observing mind falls in to the quantum mechanical foundations of biology, and there you see flux, you see something. You see change. And if you watch it a lifetime, a century, a millennia, as a brotherhood or a sisterhood of people accumulating and passing on data, eventually you can make statements about this flux. Statements such as, it is composed of parts. Its parts are not infinite in number. In fact, its parts are 64 in number. And so I think that what they were doing was they were experientially practicing quantum mechanics by giving a phenomenologically accurate description of the ebb and flow of quantum bioelectronic flux in the body, and they created a notation system, just the way chemists created a notation system for the physical elements. They created this system of 64 notations and said, you know, this kind of flux is related to human concepts of innocence, the unexpected. This kind of flux is related to the human concept of the well, or the marrying maiden, or the army, or something else. In other words, the hexagrams. So I think the whole of the universe, including, and this refers to your comment, including the lunation cycles, are actually built up out of resonances that come out of the quantum mechanical domain. Do you see how that could work? Yeah.
Following that line of thought, is it possible to use these graphics for personal information as an oracle?
Well, that's an interesting question, too. Let me answer first. The question was, is it possible to use this wave as a personal description of the ebb and flow of novelty in your own life? Yeah, oh yeah, the next 18 years, no, we'll get to that. Here, but let me follow this thing through about the personal thing. This was also a crisis for astrology. Astrology was originally a tool of statecraft used to chart the destiny of the imperium. It was only in Hellenistic times, when a yuppie class evolved inside Hellenistic civilization, that there became a market for personal horoscopes, and then it began to be developed. One thing you can do, and I mean, this is all experiment, this isn't dogma, but one thing you can do that's very interesting is you can take your birth date and add 67 years, 104.25 days to your birth date, and enter that date as the end date, instead of December 21st, 2012. And if you enter that date as an end date, striking numbers of people claim that it gives a good description of the ebb and flow of novelty in their own lives. Now, I'm not sure that's true. If it's true, here's my interpretation of what that means. It means that this big wave that we're looking at should be thought of as the average of all the little waves that we each represent. I'm one, you're one. Everybody and everything has a wave associated with it. Every person, every plant, every animal, and the sum total of these waves is the universal wave. And you can argue top down or bottom up. It really doesn't matter. Yeah.
Meteor that's hitting Jupiter, and there was a question brought up about how this describes the experience on Earth. I was trying to put that together. Would that mean that it wouldn't seem like a comet hitting Jupiter has anything to do with Earth unless this model applies to habit in the reverse across the universe?
Well, we'll look at the Jupiter impact, because what it says is that the most novel week of this year on this planet will be the week of July 21st. But it's not terribly novel. It's just the most novel week of this year. So it picks it up in the sense that the planetesimal impact on Jupiter falls in the bottom of the novelty trough. But but it's not a catastrophically deep or planet reshaping novelty trough. It's just the low point of the year. Oh yes, no, I don't think it will only be that. I'm just saying, you know. Yeah, I say that we already know that at the low point of novelty of this year, we already know of one really weird thing sure to happen, which is this impact point on Jupiter. Often there are low points in the wave where you don't know what the fulfillment is until you get there. But in this particular one, we already know, because we can compute from Newtonian mechanics the decay of the orbit of this object, so we know when it's going to crash into the Earth. Okay, but yeah. Yeah.
I just wanted to say, you know, you were talking about your thoughts on the meditative thing and the arising of this concept. You mentioned keeping still. And if you remember the Willem Baines text, it actually says keeping his stopping still. And if you go back and look at the archaic Chinese text, it is the picture for the heart with the line that means to stop the heart. And it can be interpreted as stopping or as exactly the interpretation that you just said. So the archaic texts support absolutely that.
The interpretation. Okay, now let's zoom in again, because I want to get into history with you, because that's where the pedal meets the metal, because that's where we really have the data. I mean, it's one thing to talk about biological history. It's quite another to look at the last 1,000 years. Okay, there's 183,000 years on the screen. The last 100,000 years, the last 45,000 years, and now I want to talk about it again. The last 22,000 years. Remember this signature before? The condensation of the Earth, the extinction of the dinosaurs, the emergence of the hominids, and then this is the melt. The last glacial melt occurred 22,000 years ago. Before that, the ice was as far south as Seattle. It was as far south as Baalbek in Lebanon. It began to break up. Then this period here, up until about 9,000 BC, this is the climax of what I'm calling this partnership paradise, this psilocybin-based African nomadic orgiastic social system that was the last sane moment we ever knew. You know, it is in this trough here that courage, altruism, love, self-sacrifice, community values, language, well, I don't know about language. Language is older, but it all came together here. This is what Rian Eisler and Maria Gimbutas and the enthusiasts of the partnership interpretation of Paleolithic time is all about. And then we know that, and then it's clear, something went wrong. You can see that something went wrong. There was a reversion to habit. There was a halt in the forward descent into novelty. Well, now we know from the archaeological record that right at this time, and notice that this is this is the invention of agriculture. 9,000 BC, 11,000 BP. Okay, across Europe, the Middle East, Central Russia, in the stratigraphy of this time period, we find what archaeologists call the Tanged Point Technocomplex. The Tanged Point Technocomplex is a situation where a distinctive kind of arrowhead is found in large assemblages of arrowheads. It is before this in stratigraphic levels older than 11,000 BP. If you find an arrow point, you find one arrow point. It means that somebody lost this in hunting. The Tanged Point Technocomplex is different. You find assemblages of arrow points, and these are not arrow point factories. What they are is they are sites of battles between human populations. War is invented here. This is the crisis point. Africa is drying. The mushroom is disappearing. Under the pressure of that, agriculture is being invented. Warfare is being invented. The ego is being invented as psilocybin is washed out of the human population. The old primate wiring is re-emerging, and right here, male dominance, slavery, warfare, defense of sedentary populations, etc., etc., etc. It all is invented along here. This is the fall. And as you see, it represents a significant deviation from the forward thrust into novelty that would have been a continuation of this line here.
That novelty itself?
A return to a primate pattern suppressed by hallucinogens for 100,000 years? No, it represents a return to genetic programming, to pre-existing habit, to animal organization triumphing over consciousness. It's a true setback, I would think. It's a recursion to an earlier pattern of behavior. That's habit by any measure. Yeah.
Are all the resonance screens topologically exactly the same or just similar?
Well, there are what we call direct resonances, which are topologically equivalent. And then there are near or indirect resonances, which are topologically close. And then you can set up a ranking system for that. I mean, there's a great deal about this that I'm not going to cover today. Okay, now I want to go in just a little bit more. Do you see how this works? Years. Now this is what I wanted to talk about. Here's the tanged point. Here's the invention of agriculture, the establishment of agriculture, the tanged point techno-complex, so forth and so on. But human creativity and human consciousness being what it is, you can't keep a good person down. So, about 7,200 years ago, begins a tremendous plunge into novelty, which reaches a deeper penetration toward the eschatonic attractor than has previously been achieved in the whole history of life on the planet. What is this? What is this? Well, some of you may know the work of an archaeologist named James Mellard, who excavated at a place in Turkey called Çatalhöyük. And Çatalhöyük was a city of 9,000 people practicing a goddess religion. 20% of the living space was dedicated to shrines to a cattle goddess. It was, I maintain, the last bastion of this earlier African goddess-centered cattle religion. And there's considerable archaeology to support this idea because many of the motifs on the pottery at Çatal, southern Turkey, are African animals, vultures and bison and this sort of thing. So Çatalhöyük flourished, and if you read the archaeological books about it, the archaeologists can barely contain themselves. I mean, this is 3,000 years before the building of the pyramids, and this is a civilization with flush toilets, glass, so forth and so on. A city of astonishing size, technical advancement, aesthetic magnificence, evidently large amounts of leisure time, so forth and so on. If any of you are interested, read Çatalhöyük, a Neolithic town in southern Turkey by James Mellard. Fascinating stuff.
This is 7,200 years ago.
7,200 BC. And in 6,500 BC, Çatalhöyük is destroyed. Chateau levels 5A and 6 show evidence of enormously hot fires sweeping through the entire structure. It ends right there. What happened? We know what happened. The Black Hats came. Those folks from north of Lake Van in Central Asia, the wheeled chariot people, the horse-mounted people, the Indo-Europeans, our people, the people who had domesticated the horse and invented the wheel and had simultaneously invented an entirely new lifestyle for human beings, rape and pillage over large distances supported by wheeled vehicles and horsepower. And we know then that the Indo-European waves of invasion were coming across the Anatolian plateau at that time. They destroyed Çatalhöyük, and follows a period of retraction, habituation, return to earlier forms. But again, so much technology, language, and sophistication had accumulated that it was very hard to keep that commitment to habit and recidivism going. So up here, there's a symmetry break, you see, and then in perfect agreement with the wave, you get like strings, like pearls on a string, descending down this gradient deeper into novelty. You get Sumer, Chaldea, Babylon, Egypt. The wave actually supports the theosophical hallucination that Egypt attained a cultural level never before attained in the history of the earth, and not surpassed until Hellenistic times. That's the fact of the matter, and the wave portrays it perfectly. Yeah.
At the bottom of the trough, we also have simultaneously the creation of stone of Newgrange, and directly going up the thing, the Stonehenge too.
Yes, this trough of novelty here, this is the culmination of a kind of echo of our own history. See how this gradient here is like an echo of this gradient here? This is the sweep from Sumer to the Great Pyramid. This is the sweep from Minoan Crete to the Eschaton and Starflood. So it's like an echo. It's almost as though history happened twice and ended the first time around 2300 BC, and then began again around 940 BC and swept toward the the Mayan millennial moment of December 21st, 2012. And here's history's fractal mountain, you know, from the Great Pyramid to Michael Jackson, right here. History's fractal mountain, yes.
Rise of habit up to the last peak, right, 940 BC.
I'll explode it and talk about it. Zip, 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 zip. There it is. So the question was, if the great, now, this being Maui, I hope we're not about to cross a Rubicon here. The Great Pyramid the cornerstone was placed in September 2790 BC. If you have a different date, it's your problem to defend it. 50,000 years ago, placed by Vagans passing by 20 million years ago, you've got a tough row to hoe. It was placed in September of 2790 BC. You know, you just have to like it or lump it. So here it is, right down here. And then what we see, and I don't know how much you know about Egyptian history, but the Great Pyramid is built at the end of a period of civilized unfoldment and is immediately followed by a collapse of Egyptian society. For about 250 years, no monuments are dedicated and no buildings of any major size are built. The Great Pyramid marks the end of what is called the Old Kingdom. The New Kingdom, or what's called dynastic Egypt, begins then about 250 years later. There was some kind of social collapse in that period that we don't know very much about. Something happened. Then from the beginning of dynastic Egypt on, they're always looking back to the Golden Age. I mean, even 1,000 years before Christ, the Egyptians were talking about the good old days and how could they get back to it and so forth and so on. So then what the wave shows is after the achievements of Egyptian civilization, a conservative, habitual, recidivist, and traditional return to patterns occurred, although it's quite dramatically punctuated with certain developments. If we look at the civilizations of the ancient world and place them along this gradient, what we discover here is a whole bunch of badass characters. The Mitanni, warrior people of uncertain origin, they conquer Egypt. They're followed by the Hyksos, an even more brutal and conquering people who leave no textual evidence and very little evidence of any civilization other than what they had ripped off from the higher civilizations they had conquered. That's followed by the Assyrians, equally badass. And so what we have are a series of ever more warlike, male-dominated, slave-run imperial states basing their economies on chariot-driven warfare and conquest. And that continues. Now, there are some important deviations from this. The Phoenicians invent writing in the bottom of this trough here. And then there is this symmetry break up here at the top. In terms of real history, that point, 948 AD, is when Minoan Crete, the last bastion of the goddess-worshipping culture that had been preserved out of Africa at Çatalhöyük, falls to Mycenaean pirates. This is the age of Agamemnon. This is the age when Homer sang his song. Homer sings his song at the top of this crest. And I had a professor of history at Cal who said, if you want to know where it all went wrong, it all went wrong when the Greeks stopped being fishermen and pulled their boats up onto the shore and started talking philosophy. That's when it all went wrong. And that's what this shows. It shows that there was an enormous shift in cultural values that created the cascade into novelty that leads in an almost direct line to our own predicament, and that is certainly true. So now I'll any questions on that? Okay, I'll zoom in now. years, 2,800 years, and this is what I wanted to talk about. Now we're getting down to the short and curly years, because this is something we know about. This is from 589 AD to 1998. The screen is filled with predictions. It's not shy. It's not sleight of hand. It says where the novelty was and where it wasn't. How's it doing? Is it getting it right? Because you see, there's a certain kind of intellectual obligation building here. If it's right and right and right and right and right, then it must be ultimately right. And in that case, the world is about to transform itself. We are so close to being absorbed into the event horizon of the eschatonic object that all you have to do is smoke a bomber or sit and daydream, and you can see it behind closed eyelids. I mean, it is impinging on 20th century history with the impact of the sun rising over a darkened landscape. It is here. It is here. Just a minute. So, or I'm... This is the Dark Ages here, when culture fell so low in Europe that the Byzantine thinker Microbius claimed that the circumference of a circle was twice its diameter. That's what happened to science in Europe in the Dark Ages. If it hadn't been for the Arabs preserving these Greek manuscripts in monasteries, we would have essentially gone back to a pre-Greek level of civilization. So the Arab thing was very central there. Okay, then what it shows is an incredible descent into novelty in the middle 10th century. Several things are going on. First of all, let's just get rid of the Maya. That's them taking the final dive, walking out of their cities, so forth and so on. But in terms of global novelty, the collapse of the Maya had very little consequence on Chinese, Indian, or European history. In fact, zero consequences. It wasn't even going to be known that they existed for several hundred years into the future. But what was happening that was having an impact on all of the rest of global culture was at Cordoba and at Baghdad, Islamic rulers, the Umayyads, in the case of Baghdad, were establishing incredible patronage of the science and the arts and architecture and design, engineering, and out of all that comes the invention of algebra, which may not seem like a big thing, but it lays the basis for the calculus and hence modern science. So this plunge into novelty is really the birth of modern science under the aegis of the Umayyads and the Cordoban caliphs, and has very little to do with Europe, okay? Okay, then the next one, the next plunge into novelty is over here. It's not as deep as that one, and it doesn't fall from so high a point, but nevertheless, it's dramatic. 1122, the Crusades, specifically the Second Crusade, which was the important one. What this means is that the insularity of Christian Europe begins to dissolve under the impact of contact with the Orient. And it had the impact on Europe that trade with an extraterrestrial civilization would have today. I mean, they had never seen silk brocades, perfume, pearls, spices. A psychedelic stuff is what it was. And it was pouring into Europe and creating new classes of people, new canons of aesthetics, new types of music, architecture, so forth and so on. But then this return to habit here is what I call the medieval eschaton, the freezing out. You know, this is the high Gothic era where Europe is locked in contemplation of the teachings of the Galilean. No science exists. Art is only in the service of religion. Politics serves religion. Everything is locked in the contemplation of the Christian message. And then look, something happens here. A startling collapse into novelty in the middle 1300s, reaching its apex, reaching its deepest descent into novelty in the year 1356. What happened in 1356? 1/3 of the population of Europe dies in 18 months under the influence of the Black Plague. the greatest demographic collapse Europe has ever experienced, and it came from Central Asia, where we have no data, but we can presume that it killed as many people in those places as it did in Europe. It was a tremendously novel event in that many people died, but society rebounded rather quickly to its old habits because it did not represent a technological innovation or an intellectual breakthrough like the invention of algebra. It was simply a catastrophe, and society responded by returning rather quickly to the previous levels. I mean, if this is 1356, the top of this puppy is 1440. So in 100 years, they were able to sort of re-establish European cultural institutions and come out of that body blow. But obviously, there was a tremendous symmetry break up here at the top of this thing, and I want to magnify it so we can see it here. Okay, so here's the Black Death, 1356. Here's 1440. Clearly the initiation of a very steep symmetry break, a steep descent into novelty. What happened in 1440? Johannes Gutenberg printed the first Bible at Mainz near Frankfurt in Germany. Printing was invented. A technological and informational revolution like nothing the world had ever seen, on a scale with the invention of the alphabet or perhaps the invention of language itself. But that ain't all. 15 years later, in 1455, just as we go over the lip of this thing, the Ottoman Turks seize Constantinople and chop off all European access to the markets of the Far East. This is a total body blow to the evolution of the European economies, and a group of previously obscure northern Italian cities decide to pool their money and take a chance on some new shipbuilding and navigation techniques, and decide that they will attempt to sail around Africa to avoid dealing with the blockage of passage to the east by the Turks' seizure of Constantinople. These are the Renaissance. These people become the Renaissance princes because these previously poor Italian villages, Siena, Florence, Padua, Cordova, Civitella, they become the jewels of the Italian Renaissance. This is the Italian Renaissance, this incredible plunge into novelty. Everybody you ever heard of in the Italian Renaissance is on that gradient. You know, the early guys up here, Fra Angelico, and like that, Donatello, Caravaggio, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Botticelli, the whole bit, and while all this art is being made, don't forget all kinds of invention is taking place as well. And the whole thing reaches its culmination at the bottom of this trough, 1492. Okay, now 1492 has been called the Anno Mirabilis since it happened, the year of miracles, because it was in a single year the Muslims were expelled from Spain, and these voyages of exploration were undertaken that led to the discovery of the New World. Unlike the Black Plague, where the rebound was quick, there was no rebounding from the novelty unleashed by the Italian Renaissance and the discovery of the New World. Instead, there's a long, long period in which that novelty has to be assimilated. And this is like the age of the marvelous. This is the age of the cult of the court of Rudolph in Prague. This is a period of time which stretches from 1492 to 1619. The entirety of the 16th century is along the bottom of this trough. And if you know anything about European history, you know that the 16th century was the most exotic century of the last 500 years before the 20th. I mean, this is where alchemy reached its great inflorescence. The Rosicrucian Enlightenment, the careers of Dr. Dee Henry Cornelius Agrippa, Giordano Bruno, all of that is happening here, including the discovery of the New World. Well, then something happens here, and this whole thing abruptly comes to an end. There's an end to the era of novelty in 1619. Well, what happened in 1619? Right, I know. You haven't a clue. In 1619, the 30 Years' War began. The 30 Years' War created modern Europe. When the 30 Years' War begins, Europe is thoroughly medieval, ruled by popes and kings. At the end of the 30 Years' War, Europe is a continent of nations, ruled by parliaments and councils. Here it is, warfare, destroying the novelty achieved here, but with major exceptions. I call this Newton's notch. That's the founding of the Royal Society in England, Newton's Principia, Cartesian logic, so forth and so on. It all is, and the English Civil War is here, the Restoration, so forth. Wars of religion. Then, in 1740, it changes. This steep descent into novelty, from roughly 1740 to 1845, is, in its early phase, what's called the European Enlightenment, the French encyclopedists, Voltaire, all that, and in its later phase, what's called the Industrial Revolution. The American Revolution, 1776, right here. The French Revolution follows, 1789, right here. The restoration of Louis Napoleon, so forth and so on. And then this bump here is simultaneously the Franco-Prussian War in European history and the American Civil War in American history. Yeah.
I would imagine a lot of people would include, along with the Italian Renaissance and the Greek Golden Age, the birth of Christ as one of those points where the graph should do something. And I noticed we skipped over that. I'd just be curious to see what it looked like in 0.
Okay, well, we can go back to it. You're quite right. The life of Christ is very interesting because, of course, Christ is Christ, but he lived simultaneously during the reign of one of the greatest civil and military reformers of all time. I mean, Christ lived in the era of Augustinian Rome. So it's a tremendous era of novelty. I can tell you what's going on. Remember how I said at Minoan Crete it starts a cascade, and then that cascade doesn't flatten out until the fall of Rome. So it's in a very steep period of descent into novelty. After I go through this, I'll go back and pick it up for you if there's time. What I want to do is I want to fly toward modernity here. And here, I'll do it fairly quickly. Yes.
This is a very Eurocentric viewpoint. Would you get the same timeline, for instance, with an Eastern culture, like the Chinese culture?
Well, two things to that. Number one, you're right, and I'll come back to that. Number two, Oriental history shows a curious parallelism with Western history. In other words, the great, the Roman Empire rises and falls almost in perfect concert with the Han Dynasty. So, you can say it's Eurocentric, although the Islamic role is strongly accentuated. I agree that it's Eurocentric. What kind of world are you living in? A Eurocentric world. The Maya, for all their accomplishments, don't deserve a blip of great depth in a universal novelty description like this, because who did they influence?
But for instance, a lot of the Chinese inventions were transferred to Europe.
Oh yeah, well that kind of thing shows up very well. Yeah, global evolution of technology, it picks up very well.
Terence,
Yeah,
who did the Mayans influence?
no one. No one. Because there was no, I mean the Toltecs a little, but who did they influence? The Toltecs, you know, in the Valley of Mexico.
Terence, you know the other resonance that they have there on the for example, 1313 is, you mentioned the collapse and retaking of the Holy Land by the Arabs and what have you. You also have at that point the collapse and diaspora of the Templars, who gave rise to the whole age of chivalry and you know, the troubadour and all of that, the spreading through of medieval Europe of those esoteric ideas gained in the Holy Land during that same period of time.
That's right, the Angevine court of Eleanor of Aquitaine and that whole business. Okay, now let's zoom in on modern history and finer scale stuff, because I want to show you it doesn't only work on things on a scale of 1,000 years. Okay, there's 715 years on the screen, 357 years on the screen, 178, 89 years. Let's look here for just a moment. This is from 1906 to 1996. This is a good place to show you how the resonances work. Remember how I talked about Ur, Chaldea, Babylon, and then Egypt at the bottom of the trough of history's fractal mountain? Well, what's at the bottom of that trough here? 1933.
What? WPA?
Well, WPA, I hadn't thought of that. Large-scale building projects. WPA. How about this? A cult of a godlike leader. A fascination with overscale architecture, a tendency to mistreat Jews. What have we got here? We've got Nazi Germany. The word Führer and the word Pharaoh are actually etymologically related. The static, monolithic, slave labor style of ancient Egypt is recreated inside the Third Reich. Is that not weird? I ask you. Okay, so this is the early 20th century, relativity, this descent into novelty. Relativity, 1906. Quantum, Dada, 1919. Surrealism, the Manifesto, 1922. The Copenhagen Conference on Quantum Physics, 1923. The, you know, radio, all of it, powered light, blah, 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 blah. World War, the Third Reich, then World War II fought across the bottom of this trough here, ending in the explosion of the atom bombs. Now, after World War II, what people were interested in was literally a return to normalcy. It was called that, the return to normalcy. You know, we've whipped Hitler, we've called down the power of the stars upon our enemies. Now we just want to go back and marry the girl next door and barbecue and buy some tube furniture and get a Chevy and make nice. Make nice. And here it is, you know, a period of traditional activity, recidivism, conservatism, so forth and so on. And now I'll zoom in a little more. Before I do, the early 1960s here, and then right here, right at the top, no, landing on the moon. Landing on the moon, the hippies, LSD, the whole ball of wax. I mean, basically at the very, very top of this thing, to the day, the human being in the Panhandle in San Francisco. Now, if that doesn't confirm my own inner agenda, I don't know what possibly could. Here, let's go in and have a look at it.
Where's the Grand Central Station be?
Oh, we'll get there. 44 years, there's the top of the 60s. 22 years, the Reagan-Bush era. 11 years. 11 years and 2 months. The last 11 years. Now, remind yourself, we have not moved the positioning. We have started with 6 billion years. We're down to 11 years. Everything is being generated from this point in 2012. It's been right. And now, the last 11 years, from 83 to 94. Okay, this is, in resonance, the fall of Rome. In fact, the end of the Reagan era. This point here, well, I'm going to go in one more scale, because I want you to see this. Because we've been through a lot in the past 5 years, 7 months, and 1 day, I believe. By the way, see this little pointer that has appeared? It's pointing at today. It's pointing at today. Okay. Let's go through these low points. This one, June 89, Tiananmen Square massacre, 3 million people, perhaps the largest crowd in history, halt in its tracks. The largest and most totalitarian government on the planet for 30 days is paralyzed until it discovers a traditional solution to the problem, mass murder of its own citizens. Okay, go forward. Next low spot, November November 1989. The Berlin Wall falls to the day, right there, the novelty trunk. Okay, now this spot is interesting. This spot, the bottom of this little trough here, on the next higher level is the birth of Mohammed. The exact resonance date here of the birth of Mohammed is August 3rd, 1990. Saddam Hussein seizes Kuwait on the day of the resonance of Muhammad's birth. So and Muhammad died.
Did he know that?
Over here. No. They never know. Muhammad died here. So here's the seizure of Kuwait. Then remember all the breast beating and the moving of troops around and all that. That goes on up to here. Then this is the issuing of the UN ultimatum, which made war inevitable. Here is the air war, this descent here, early January 1991. The ground war, and if I were to blow up the bottom of this slope for you, you'd see that it's wildly fluctuating on the fine scale. But the land war is there. Okay. Next low point, August 1991. The kidnapping of Gorbachev and the first Soviet coup d'etat, right there. I'm going to skip over this one because the only interesting thing that happened there was that two interesting things happened, actually. Food of the Gods was released that day. And I hate to tell you, but Ross Perot went on Larry King and allowed as how maybe he would run for president. Okay, then this low point here, wait a minute, let me make sure I got my ducks in a row. Let me use the pointer, actually. See, this tells me the exact date. Can you see that pointer?
How's the map?
There's Clinton's election, right there, in that low trough. And as you see, then we have come up. We've come up. Today, what was the date of the LA earthquake? January what? That's January 13th. But you see the symmetry break. If I go one keystroke further, that's the 19th. So you see how tight on it is. Okay, so then today is February 27th. Now we'll fly in and have a look at it. No. And that should tell you something.
What if it goes like straight up? Like we can look at the ones that go novel straight down.
Just a sec, because I can't take my eyes off this thing. There's 1 year, there's 8 months, there's 4 months, 2 months, 1 month, 15 days, 7 days, the last 7 days, the last 3 days, the last day, the last 23 hours. Now, I think we're getting close to the range limit. Let me do a couple of things here, a couple of housekeeping things. And what I want to do is move today's date over to the other side of the screen so that we can look at the future. That's what's interesting now, because there's so little of it left, you see. We've been looking at 6 billion years. There's only 18 years left. I often wonder, so what if it were true? I'd hardly have time to enjoy my notoriety. Now, specify target date. C, month, 2, 27, 1994. No. Okay, now specify time span, 20 years. E.
From today?
I think so, if I did it right. Years, 20. Plus months, no. Plus days, no. Okay. Now, do we have everything right? Graph the wave. Graph the wave. Yes. Okay, now see the pointer over here? That's pointing at today. Now remember how I said the impact on Jupiter was the week of July 21? Let me run the pointer forward. There is August 5th, 1994, and the one stroke back, the 16th of July, 1994. See, it's right there. Now, the reason I wanted to show you this, other than just the razzle-dazzle of the future, is look what's coming. We've got a test of sufficient force coming that if the wave fails this test, I wouldn't think it would be necessary to hang on till 2012, because this is a very major test of the theory. And what it's saying is that beginning around January 23rd, 1996, and lasting until May 1st, 1996, a period of only 64 days, there is going to be an enormous rush into novelty. And I have no idea what we're looking at. We could be looking at revolution in China, AIDS cure, planetesimal impact, Hawaiian independence, or all of those and more. But that's where it'll be, early 96. The analog is the Umayyad Caliphate and the invention of algebra. So it may be that it's the evolution of some kind of incredibly powerful mathematical technique that will configure technology and science for the rest of the 18 years left to us. Now, I also wanted to show you this because this explains the this compression that is going on in historical time. Remember how I pointed out how the Nazis were very much like Old Kingdom Egypt? Well, everything is being lived in these lower level resonances at high rates of acceleration and compression, so that, for example, what took 11 years in the past takes 6 days or something like that in the present. So fads and fashion are the place to look for the ebb and flow of this stuff. We right now are in the early 8th century, early 9th century. Clinton is our Charlemagne. The revolt in Mexico is in resonance with the Mayan collapse and going on in the very same area. This is how it works. It's a kind of a lens for seeing how the future unfolds along certain themes. So what I would predict here is some radical gains, or something radical here having to do with ideas and Islam. Maybe a young Palestinian physicist will write the unified field theory or something like that. Then the rest of the 90s, where are we? 90, what's going on? Oh, 99. This is the rest of the 90s, carries us only into the High Gothic period, the medieval period. Well, for sure, the fundamentalists are just going to camp on the millennium. I mean, they truly believe that Jesus is coming. So, this whole period around 2000 will be monopolized by Christian rhetoric and hoopla. Then, beyond that, it looks like, I would hate to think that this is some kind of new plague, but we do have in the early years of the next century the resonance with the Black Death. Further on, in 2004 to 5, the Italian Renaissance in 2004, ending in late 2005 with the discovery of the New World, which I would predict is a water-heavy, oxygen-rich planet around of Alpha Centauri, or Beta Centauri. Just as an aside, did you know that Beta Centauri, which aside from the red dwarf Alpha Centauri, is the nearest star? Beta Centauri is the most sun-like star within 70 light years of this planet. It's incredibly sun-like, 1.1 solar masses, and burning in the same part of the spectrum as the sun. It's entirely possible that in 2004 we will have sufficient instrumentality that if there are planets around Beta Centauri, they will swim into view. And if they're water-heavy and oxygen-rich, we will have discovered the new world. Or it may be, that somebody constructs a doorway into DMT land or something else. But 2004, the discovery of the new world. 2009, the equivalent of the Industrial Revolution, and then all of the 19th and 20th century compressed into the next 2 years, leading to the spin down, because the shortest cycle is not 67 years, 104.25 days. There are shorter cycles. There's a 384-day cycle that will begin 384 days before December 21st, 2012, and that into 384 days will pack all the resonances of all previous cycles. There will then be a 6-day cycle at the end, packing all the resonances and associations into 6 days. There will then be an hour and 35-minute cycle, then a 1.3 second cycle. And in other words, the thing is just hurtling toward the omega point. Imagine this. if you had a universe like the kind of universe I'm describing that was 72 billion years old and that had 27 levels of spiral involution built into it with a collapse factor of 64, dig this, then half of its becoming would occur in the last 6.5 hours of its existence. The universe would be only half completed 6.5 hours before its final completion, because the short epochs happen so rapidly. So this is what I think lies ahead. People, it's, you know, not permaculture, not Hawaiian independence, not cheap beer, but something so off the wall that the laws of space and time themselves are going to be melted, condensed, and rolled together. This is a process. I showed it to you. It's been rolling forward for 72 billion years. It's never arrived a moment late anywhere along the line. It's on time, it's under budget, and novelty, which we represent, which life represents, which civilization represents, novelty is the proof of it, and novelty is ingressing into three-dimensional space-time at precisely the rates that the theory predicts. It explains why we're here. It explains how the cosmic drama works, and it gives permission to drop anxiety, because we're locked into an eternal process of alchemical rarefaction of novelty that is very close now to the culmination. The eschatonic body, the coincidentia positorum, the philosopher's stone, the UFO, the body and blood of our Lord, it's all about to enter history. This is the persistent and incredibly irrational assurance of Western religion that what other people used to call God, that God would enter history. History is the shock wave of eschatology. The presence of history on this planet means that we are only geological microseconds away from the full revelation of the presence of the eschaton. It is causing history. History is a distorted perspective on a higher dimensional object that is pulling all process into itself and always has been. And we barely have language for this. It's being revealed through the psychedelic experience. This is what shamans see. This is why I say a shaman is someone who has seen the end, because you leave the radical linear confinement of history and you rise up into the super space of eternity. You look left, you see the Big Bang. You look right, and you can see the entire set of universal processes being sucked into the transcendent present of the eschatonic object. Yeah.
Could this possibly be the Earth wobble theory, where the ice caps in the North and South Pole become your new equator?
I think it's more radical than that. I think it's the collapse of Newtonian space and time. I think there's nothing left at all that you can hang a label on. That you'll be neither Agnes nor Angus when this is over with. Yeah.
Does that progress in the year 2022?
2012.
2022.
Oh no. See the way that if you were to buy the software, you can put any end date in just with the keystrokes. It comes with defaulted to the December 21, 2012 date. Okay. Because let me. But you can enter any end date, and then it will scale the entire wave for you relative to the end date you gave it. I scaled it to this date because after trying hundreds and hundreds of dates, this seemed to be right at all scales. This seems to work. Now, if you take this seriously and you try to make rational sense of this revelation, and it is a revelation, and dig the fact that it's a very strange revelation because it's absolutely self-limiting. I'm hung out to dry if nothing happens. It imposes its own test. It says, you know, we will deliver, or you're free to reject it. So it isn't some vague promise about someday or soon or no. Dawn, Greenwich, 18 minutes after 11 a.m., December 21st, 2012, Greenwich Mean Time. The eschaton will rise in the east and consume the solar system, and so forth and so on. Now, what did I want to say about this? I can't remember. There was something. Go ahead.
I'm going to suggest that you take the progression to the year 2022.
You mean try that as an end date? Well, that
not an end date, a now date, progression date.
Well, let me explain to you, like, short of the absolute consummation of the world and the ascent into the angelic imperium, how could this be fulfilled? How could this be fulfilled and be true and yet somehow not leave no stone upon another?
Nuclear war.
No, nuclear war is a recidivist return to hell. Here's the one thing that could happen, as I see it, that could fulfill the prophecy and yet leave three-dimensional space and time intact. One thing I've noticed about the wave is that it's excellent at predicting the evolution of technology. Technology and novelty are very closely related concepts in the cosmos of the time wave. How would it be if what happens at 18 minutes after 11 a.m. on December 22nd, 2012, is that a button is pushed, and for the first time in the history of this planet, a person moves through time. The sequential linearity of history ends. And then we would all say, of course, history ended. Because, and I discussed this with the mushroom, and it told me a very strange thing, which I didn't believe at the time. It said time machines are possible, but you can only go back in time as far as the moment of the invention of the first time machine. Because before that, there were no time machines. And how can you take a time machine into a universe where, by definition, time machines do not exist? That would introduce a paradox. So then I thought about it, and I thought, and follow me through on this, I thought, here's the picture. It's a few moments before sunrise in the Amazon, December 21st, 2012 AD, at the World Temporal Institute. The first person is about to be sent into the future. The Lady Temponaut is strapped into the machine in full view of a worldwide three-dimensional virtual reality hookup. Everybody is watching. A brief speech is made, a countdown from 20, a button is pushed, and off she goes into the future. Now, the interesting question at this point, I think, is what happens, to use an obsolete word, next? What happens next? And I think in that kind of a universe, what would happen next is that thousands, tens of thousands of time machines would begin arriving at the end of the time road. They would have come back to see the first trip into time. They would arrive from all points in the future at the end of the road to witness the first time travel. Now, this idea lasted for about 24 hours. And then I realized there's a problem here. There's something called the grandfather paradox that is always introduced in discussions about time travel. And it is this. If you were able to travel back in time, you could kill your grandfather. If you killed your grandfather, you would not exist. Therefore, you could not have traveled back in time and killed your grandfather. Therefore, we're hung out to dry here on some kind of a paradox. And the only way around that paradox, because you see, in the kind of time travel the mushroom says is allowed, the traveling back to the moment of the first time machine's invention, you could still have a grandfather paradox. Because if your grandfather was born in 2022 and you were born in 2080, on your way back to 2012, you could stop in 2025 and kill your infant grandfather. So what do we do about this? The solution is this. When the button is pushed, when the Lady Temponod sails off into the future, what happens is not that time machines arrive instantly from all points in the future. Something much more radical happens. The rest of history happens instantaneously. It all happens instantaneously. There is a collapse of the illusion of linear time. I call this the God whistle. What you do is you sound this shrill tone, and the rest of universal history is like magically removed, and the next serial moment is the last moment in the history of the universe, and you go into the highest state of evolution that the universe can achieve in its entire history. So what this is a kind of fast-forward button. You think you're inventing time travel. What you're really inventing is a button which causes the rest of time to happen instantly, and then the entire global civilization moves into eternity. It's a curious thing, but hey, what isn't? Yeah.
How do you relate this to apocalyptic theory, to second coming, to...
Excellent question. Here's how I relate it to it. Through the resonances that we've been looking at here, it's clear that if time is this kind of fractal that I'm talking about, then it's a series of embedded modules that are complete within themselves, so that the entire history of the universe is in some sense recapitulated in every minute, every hour, every day, every year, every century, is a recapitulation or an anticipation of the highest cycle of time. So a Christ, a Buddha, a Mohammed is simply a person who stood in a certain geometric relationship to the object at the end of time. You know how you can stand on a hill and the glass windows of a house across the valley will be blinding, but if you move just a few feet, it disappears into the general environment. These are people who were as ordinary as you and me, except for their perspective on the eschaton. And these were the biggies: Christ, Buddha, Mohammed. Every single one of us, from, Joe Shako Guru to you and me, we all have a perspective on the eschaton. It's within us. Genetic encoding. Anticipation. So everything that, so the promise of Western religion, well, here's the way to think of it. Think of the eschaton, this object in eternity, pulling everything toward itself. Think of it as one of those mirrored balls that they hang in discos and spin, and you know how it causes moving lights on the walls? Those are reflections of the bar ball, but they're distorted reflections. And all reflections are distorted. So David Koresh's version of things, Charles Manson's version, Buddha's version, Hitler's version, Christ's version, everybody's version is slightly, or more than slightly, tweaked. Including mine, of course. All versions are tweaked. But the closer you get to the end of the road, the less tweaked the versions are, because the radiance of the thing is growing in power. So a shaman 50,000 years ago in his cave in the south of France taking mushrooms, he looks forward and there's a dim glimmering, a something, a transcendental hope, a possibility. Now you take mushrooms and you can almost see the radiance of the eschaton shining through ordinary reality. And all these religions are anticipations of this thing, and your own transcendent hopes are an anticipation of this thing. We can tune into the eschaton, and this is what psychedelics are. That's why I said a shaman is someone who has seen the end. A shaman is someone who knows how the story comes out and can therefore return to ordinary linear time, take their place in the drama with a total absence of anxiety, and then be a wonderful role model, curer, and paradigm for other people who lack this critical piece of knowledge, the nature of the end. Yeah.
Would it be your suggestion that at 11 a.m. on December 21st in 2012 to be heavily dosed?
It's like raising a lighted match to greet a supernova.
Yes. It seems to me that the basic paradox between traditional scientific thought and what Rupert is talking about, you're talking about, Abrams is talking about, the people in quantum physics, Goswami and those guys, revolves around the issue of teleology and the rejection of teleology, and this causes the absolute collapse of that denial that something in the future can influence and cause an event in the past. And that is the philosophical peg around which all of this is working.
That's right. Let me explain what's being said here. Teleology is a fancy philosophical word for purpose. If you have a telos, you have a purpose. And it has been very, very important to modern science to remove teleology from its explanations. Even the theory of evolution, which is the most teleological of scientific theories, real hardcore evolution, materialist evolutionists will tell you, don't think of it as progress. It's not progress. It's random mutation being acted upon by selective forces in the environment. But don't think that an elk is more advanced than an amoeba, or that a gray whale is more advanced than a sponge. There is no progress here. There is simply sideways mutation toward different form. But I say this contravenes reason. There obviously is progress. But progress means movement toward a goal. That's a purpose. That movement toward a goal is a purpose, and they go berserk when you try to inject teleology.
Undermines the causation.
That's right.
Basic
That's right.
Of modern science.
Yes, you see, 19th century science arose in an atmosphere of what was called deism. Deism was the current form of Christian theology that said that the universe was a kind of universal machine that God had built and set running and then gone away and left. And the 19th century Darwinists and the Wallaces, they wanted to get away from teleology, so they built logical systems where everything proceeds from cause to effect. Everything is pushed from the past toward the future. I'm saying exactly the opposite. Using the new language of chaos theory and dynamics, I'm saying the future contains an attractor, a kind of energy low point in the topology, and history is like releasing a ball bearing on a stretched rubber sheet that has a low point. Where will the ball bearing roll? Where will it end up? In the low point. And it may even circle around the low point as it rattles down into the bottom like a pinball in a pinball machine. This is perfectly reasonable. It's just incredibly unwelcome in the domain of science. But I think that science has betrayed itself by not admitting that over all scales of time and all scales of phenomena, novelty is being conserved, is refining, building upon itself, and accelerating its approach toward an ideal state of perfection, and that is this eschatonic body. Yeah.
You said that science is betraying, it doesn't want to, but the 210 to 64 is also it's a major number in computers, technology, which is a culmination of science, and also genetic code, DNA. 64, it's all interlinked together. So once science recognizes that, if they're going to come to the realization that they were wrong.
Yeah, the problem is, as I said at the beginning of today, that science as we know it will not survive this revolution because time is a variable, and all science that has been done to date has treated time as an invariant. And if we want to understand love affairs, revolutions, corporate takeovers, brain tumors, if we want to understand the things that matter to us as organisms, we're going to have to create an entirely new definition of what science is about and what it's looking at. Yeah.
Everything you measure is altered by the act of measuring.
That's right.
So therefore, if it were a giant flywheel, everything spinning, everything repeating, that's the what people perceive is as well as that perfect repetition, there's a slight vibration of the machine, and that's what most people perceive, and that's what they are, a slight and irrelevant imperfection, the cycle of infinite recurrence.
And that is the resonance and analog on the quantum physics level.
Correct.
Of spirit being the motivating factor for matter rather than the reverse, as in your discussions of teleology and the causation-driven theories. You see where?
That's right. That's why there are 64 species of time. That's why DNA is the way it is. DNA is like iron filings arranging themselves in the presence of a deeper magnetic ordering field, the principle of 64. That's the 64 hexagrams are mental categories, iron filings on a different level, but all configuring themselves to reflect these universal principles of hierarchical ordering and interrelatedness. Now, to a degree, it's an indulgence on my part to tell you all this because it's just my theory, or that's how a straight person would see it. From my point of view, this is what the mushroom said. From the mushroom's point of view, this is square one. This is what you know if you know anything. This is what you know if you've ever been off the block. Of course you know the nature of space-time, matter, and energy. Yeah.
As an astronomer had explained it to me that in the beginning of the creation of the universe, everything passed through a single point. And what I'm beginning to hear from you is it's almost like we've seen creation backwards, where we're coming to the beginning of time, going through the central point. So it's actually coming, it's telescoping back to the origin of where everything began.
Yes, the scientific theory is called the Big Bang. The theory I've put out this morning I would call the big surprise. And the big surprise comes at the end and not at the beginning. Yeah.
Well, what I'm seeing is that there really is no beginning or end. What you're saying, where we're going is to the eye of the thorn, the eye.
We're going outside the cycle of cause and effect.
Exactly. And the thing is, haven't you all noticed that people being Amanita, Messieri, and magic mushrooms, psilocybins, and smoking hemp on a massive scale is exactly coincided with the advent of ecological concern? Now there's a tale your biology teachers never told you.
That the rise of ecological concern and the awareness of plant consciousness through psychedelics are simultaneous phenomena. I mean, essentially, the Gaian mind is coming into focus. history is ending. The evidence of your senses is true. It can't go on much longer. It can't go on much longer. What you thought you saw was real. Right. And there is built into the physics of this universe, local or general, who knows, this bootstrapping circularity that is going to lift us to higher and higher levels. Now, what I want to say about this as we're getting close to the end, is you should not believe this. I don't believe this. I got as far as I got by not believing anything. The mushroom specifically said, when I said, why are you telling me this? It said, because you don't believe anything. This is a hypothesis to be tested. It is not a religious faith to kneel down in front of. It is mathematically anchored, as modern theories have been since the 1850s, and it can be tested and possibly overthrown by ordinary methods of discourse and analysis. It is not a mystical teaching. It does not depend on belief. It's a series of interlocking mathematical assertions that are open to test. And I cannot imagine what the purpose of my 25-year-long involvement with this is unless there is some measure of truth in this. I have studied other channelings from the Urantia book through whatever, and it isn't like this. Nobody gets it down to a mathematical algorithm that can be submitted to the desk of science for a visa stamp. This is coming from the same place where those things not based on faith, but on the deeper implications of reason and mathematics are coming from. We do feel our planet to be in crisis. An odd thing about this theory, which I confess troubles me, as I guess the way to put it, is that it seems to lift obligation off of us. It seems to be saying, it's here. There is nothing left to be done. And, you know, I come out of the Berkeley Commune, a tradition of political activism, a real uncomfortableness with bad social policy and the repression of unfortunate classes, races, and people. And I want to do something. I'm puzzled by the completedness of this theory. And where I rest with it is, I act as though it is not true. And I think you should act as though it is not true. You're still responsible. You can't be a jerk. You must still recycle. You must still take care of your shit. But this is permission to hope. This is permission to understand how your dreams could come true. It isn't that the flying saucers will come, or that Lemuria will rise from the sea, or that Maitreya will descend in a cloud of light. It's that the laws of physics and nature themselves have been designed to save you from what you probably deserve. So it's a psychedelic revelation that touches every aspect of human life. It's a way of looking at things, novelty and habit. It's a scientific, quote-unquote, argument for not pushing the river. It's a kind of mathematical description of the Tao. I mean, if you think about the Tao Te Ching, the primary text of Taoism, in the Whaley translation, it opens like this: the way that can be told of is not an unvarying way. Now, despite the clumsy use of the double negative, not an unvarying way, what that sentence says is the way that can be told of is a varying way. A varying way. And that's what we have here. We have the universal ebb and flow of flux. one of the greatest philosophers in the Western tradition, the pre-Socratic Heraclitus, got it down to an aphorism in Greek. He said, "Pantit rea," all flows, all flows. This is the truth. Dominator psychology wishes to build stability where no stability can be permitted, in the construction of calendars, in the construction of ideologies, in the construction of relationships. This is a perversion of circumstance. Everything is in flux. Everything flows. Everything in its time is replaced by something else. This is a universal truth, and it can liberate, and it can make the felt presence of immediate experience rich, satisfying. It can, in short, give life meaning. And we are so embedded in the linear, causal, Newtonian, materialist, reductionist, dominator paradigm that the only way to climb out of that cellar and reach out for the light and the spirit that this universal flux represents is to do it with psychedelics. Our religions are too freighted with past error, philosophical and political. The only way to do it is to directly address your own psychosomatic experience of being by stepping outside of history and going back to the plants. The plants stand outside of history. They stand in the domain of biology, and they will liberate us. You and me and everybody not here and everything in space and time. We are moving toward the revelation of the universal purpose that has been in the process of defining and revealing itself since the first atoms clattered into existence. We're part of that drama, and we can join in that drama if we avail ourselves of these plant allies and make nature into a partner instead of an obstacle or an enemy. And that's all I have to say about this. Thank you very much.